with Davin Chown. As I told you, he's a board member of the South African Energy Storage Association. Davin comes with an amazing experience of almost 40 years in the energy industry. Next to his role at SAESA, he's also the managing director at Genesis Infrastructure and Renewable Energy Group. For those of you who might not be familiar with this company, it's a company focusing on solar, wind, and energy storage projects, both on the development, on the financing, on the operation side, and focusing on the South Africa and Southern African region. Prior to SAESA, Davin was also the chairman of SABIA for several months, and he also is a board member of the South African Renewable Energy Council. So I think this gives a good insight of how knowledgeable Davin is on this topic, on South Africa in particular. And so I'm very, very pleased to welcome you, Davin, for this first session. It's always challenging to be the first one to address the crowd, but I'm sure you'll do an amazing job, and I thank you for accepting the invitation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and greetings to everyone. I see we've got people from all across the continent, which is very exciting. And I think, as just to echo what John has said, it's a very exciting time, lots of change, and I'm going to perhaps spend some time creating context and background to this exciting couple of days that we have lined up. So from SAESA's side, again, welcome everybody and thank you for the opportunity. What I do want to focus on, and perhaps just to highlight from my perspective, particularly because I think it's a concern to all of us as we look around at the changes around us and the context we find ourselves in, that for us, there's a very, very clear need from an African perspective to provide clean energy sources at lower cost, to be able to help drive this economy for us, and to push us as an African continent into a much more cost competitive position in the global market. I think economically we can all understand that, and this is part of my central message and tenet to everyone today is, what does this mean for us as we talk through these sessions and we look at the context that we find ourselves in? I also think that, looking from my point of view, the health and environmental costs of polluting fuel sources and what it's doing to us and where we're spending our money, and starting to ask, as we look at economic activity across our continent, whether we couldn't be spending our money more wisely. How do we provide greater energy security to drive this economic activity and look at the benefits across our continent? And we'll talk briefly about a couple of these points, which I hope will again help shape our context. But it's trying to look at ways we remove some of these burdens, and where I certainly believe we're spending money unnecessarily, trying continually to put out the fires on our continent, so to speak, whereas we could be deploying our capital, both human and monetary, in a way that helps generate greater prosperity across this beautiful continent of ours. When I look into context, I will always say to everyone that, from my point of view, context is everything. And I know I tend to be very emphatic about this thing, but I do say, if we look at the pressing drivers that face us and the context we're in at the moment, and the backdrop to these discussions we'll be having the next couple of days, we just look to that map of what's happening in India and the unprecedented heat waves, putting lives, crops, power supply at risk in India. It's something they haven't seen, it's something we haven't seen, but it's there. It creates a certain context within which our whole global situation and Africa's positioning in that situation is very important, I would argue. The Ukraine-Russia conflict, who would have thought, as we came into this new year, hoping to emerge out of the madness of COVID and what that did, that we would have this situation emerging on our strategic radar. Again, challenging our energy future, shaping new energy futures, throwing up a whole lot of challenges for us as leaders, as people in industry, as communities, as providers of energy solutions, as to how we'd now operate within this continually changing context. And that might seem doom and gloom on one side, but I look on the other side of the picture and I see things like the investment, and I just highlighted one of them, this US investment into Tanzania, the $5 billion of investment signed up there. So sometimes the doom and gloom is there, but there's definite opportunity. There are definite ways through all of these roadblocks we seem to see being thrown up in front of us. And of course, for those of us that follow the market and look at the craziness of the financial markets and look at things like Tesla and the valuation and what that whole change, that whole new technology shift, what that's done, what it's doing to mobility, what it's going to do to e-mobility, even on our continent, the shifts that are coming in the markets. I think this is absolutely crucial for us to say, where can our technologies, our companies, our industries, our regulators, our governments and our government leadership in amongst this changing, tumultuous world, where do we find ourselves and how do we navigate? And are there, in fact, opportunities, or are we just reacting to what we see before us? But I throw into the mix this for your consideration because I've found that it intrigues me that despite some of this difficult situation we find ourselves in, we are able to look at things and take stock and look for the opportunities. Right now, I've taken some pictures just to highlight these, where we see the report, and there is this fantastic report out. You can get a link to it on qz.com, and I think the IFC guys have done this as well, is looking at the generators that are used to boost electricity supply in Africa in many parts of our continent. Right? Some brought on just by a necessity and a shortage, others just through situations like load shedding, which we have regularly in South Africa now, and I'm sure our colleagues across the continent are not unfamiliar to this. But the cost that goes with that, the environmental and health costs that get chalked up. We look at what's happening with some countries like this PepsiCo, their distribution centers and how they're looking to storage to solve some of these problems that we see before us in this changing environment. And of course, I just highlighted there some of those national renewable energy targets from various countries. Just looking at different parts of the continent and saying, there is indeed change, there is indeed forward movement. There's investment coming in. So despite, again, this tumultuous environment, where are these silver linings that I believe are laced all over our continent that we're slowly starting to open up, slowly starting to show progress and move things forward? When I do look at this argument around storage, supply of electricity, one big thing we have noted is, and particularly through this report from the IFC colleagues, and I'm sure they'll highlight some of this, the dirty footprint of the broken grid, it's called. So if we look at some of those figures and facts on the page in front of you, and I look at this and I say, certainly I think we could be spending our money more wisely. It may well be a need right now, but is this the best way? Are these the best solutions that we have? Or are the solutions ahead of us that we'll debate over the next couple of days really going to show us a clearer path, a cleaner path, a more affordable path, and one that at the same time is going to place us in the forefront of this next leap through this energy transition? And I certainly believe when I look at these numbers and I look at the absence of the grid, I clearly see a great deal of investment opportunity. And I can understand why our colleagues from the US and other countries want to invest in Africa, because we're a place waiting to happen. We're an exciting story on the verge of happening. We're a place where people can make investment happen, but that's going to take certain preconditions to be achieved. So let's perhaps talk about some of those. When we talk about a market, clearly the International Renewable Energy Agency sees a market. It's a very big one. And I know there's many projections and many studies and many cases written up and lots lectured about in halls around universities on the continent about what the potential is and what we could do. But some of these numbers really do kind of sharpen the mind and say to us, despite the difficulties, clearly there's some good opportunity. I look at the numbers from the West African Monetary and Economic Union, and that seems very, very ambitious goal. The question we might ask is, are there enough people around to achieve this? Are there enough investors? Are there people wanting to do this? Do people really see this as a significant market opportunity? And I certainly do believe it is. When I look at the West African power pool, I look at the call for tenders across the continent, I certainly see that although we might be small, if one compares it to the Chinese market and the boom that's been happening there, we may indeed look like we're at the starting blocks and just trying to get out of the starting blocks. So the ambition is definitely there. The need is there. The context tells us the old way of doing things is not going to work for much longer. And if we do go that route and persist, it certainly is going to cost us a lot more money than perhaps the alternatives that we are looking at. And that certainly for me is a driver. If I look at what the specific needs are, I think at an operational level, we're seeing this across the continent in different economies, certainly at a micro level. We see industries, businesses, communities of whatever kind they may be, starting to look at how to make these benefits tangible and real. We see that cost reduction is a no-brainer, as they would say, given the cost and what we're spending and what it's costing per kilowatt hour to keep machines on the go like those diesel gens we saw. We certainly all, I think, have experienced this issue of reliability of power supply. And we look at that report from a crowd that I looked up, this Mordor Intelligence, got some great reports. I use them for context and just to sometimes test the thinking and test the assumptions I make. That if I look at that growth that they see in diesel gensets, it tells me there's economic growth, there are things happening on our continent. We need power supply. We're opting for dirty power solutions. Aren't there cleaner power solutions, more affordable, that can be deployed? So that market size is certainly something staggering. But I then also look at other context. We're seeing more and more, particularly in South Africa, I know, a high rate of digitalization. Data centers are springing up everywhere here. And we certainly see the need for multiple layers of backup energy around these data centers. And I dare say in other parts of our continent, it's not too dissimilar as we see this digitization, which is critical for our continent to play a more prominent role as the global economic situation starts to change and the big economies tussle it out. And we find our place in that tussle and move ourselves forward. Mining as a key economic opportunity goes without saying. I think many of our economies, the miners, they struggle to keep cost contained, production going, cleanup in process. Definitely, clearly a market opportunity if I look at some of the mines and some of the folk, even on our agenda, who will talk to us about groundbreaking work done on the mines. And of course, I look to a really pressing issue on our continent, which is boosting agriculture, looking to feed a hungry continent, and for others who rely on us as a continent to provide them with food supply, and what this is going to mean for photovoltaics or agrivoltaics, as I like to call it. How do we power that nexus of food, water, energy, recycling, that cleaner transition that we talk about? Very clearly an opportunity worth exploring as we go these next couple of days. A value proposition, again, just to focus and sharpen our minds, that we'll talk about, but I think is absolutely crucial as we see deployment of mini grids, because I talked and pointed towards this broken grid of ours. We're seeing it in South Africa. Others are seeing it. We're seeing massive need for investment into this grid. But how do we look at providing solutions at different scales, where perhaps the grid cannot reach, where perhaps financing and funding is not going to achieve in the short and immediate term what we think it may, but we have this pressing need to get electricity and energy to a greater number of people. And I don't think for any of us it's much point really in highlighting those numbers about who's connected and who's not, because we all have a good sense of the 680 million people that still do not have connections to electricity supply. And what does that mean as we develop these mini grids, these microgrids, and we start looking to decentralized energy solutions that are becoming more and more the order of the day? We look at the need for grid management, reducing and in some cases deferring the need from investment into grid infrastructure at that macro level, but certainly at the micro level, looking at those investors that have come across from other parts of the world who are focused very clearly on how to take PV solutions with storage, other energy solutions, and make that grid work at a more decentralized level, which I think that value proposition speaks to quite clearly. And of course, the last point I want to leave you on this page was just as we go through all of this, I'd like us to keep in the back of our minds, which certainly from our investment colleagues, from those interacting with regulators, with policymakers and decision makers, is our contracting and commercial mechanisms. The service agreements that get signed between the different players, whether they be at the private level or with distribution and transmission system operators, whether that be tenders with government. As we look to these solutions and the need that we have, the question certainly is, how in our environment across Africa do we provide a more stable framework? I know one of the big discussions in South Africa, looking at our bid program, is there's a big discussion about how do we do away with government guarantees behind the procurement mechanisms. Is that something realistic? Is it going to create more concern? Is it perhaps going to take that 5 billion investment that we've seen going into Tanzania and perhaps throw up some questions about whether we can make the future more sustainable, more sure, and de-risk it for a greater number of players as we work together as different sectors to find these solutions and make them work for our continent. So I just raised the question about whether we can sustain a storage market, and perhaps storage is not the only market, but it has, of course, the generation side going with it, the transmission side going with it. I talk there about, for me, policy development in renewables, particularly in relation to the grid. Do we have robust frameworks? Do we have the understanding of what it might need to be to attract that investment? And of course, I talk about that regulatory certainty and enablement, that enabling environment we so often talk about. How do we create it now? How does storage technology penetrate that and work within our diverse and complex regulatory environments across the continent? Of course, private sector investment crucial. They're absolutely sensitive to the key risks. What happens when you don't get paid? What happens with the political risk? What happens? How do we manage that? How do we manage security risk? How do we manage currency risk and the volatility that often is beyond our control given global situation and we find ourselves in? Of course, the opportunity for investment and development along the entire battery value chain, I find that argument a very compelling one for Africa. It's not only Africa and our sub-regions as the users of technology, of the buyers of the latest and greatest, but it's how we take a central role and a place in beneficiation, about using those minerals that we're blessed with as a continent, strategically using them in that manufacturing chain and across that entire value chain, in fact, upstream and downstream. I think it's, if we look to just the environment I'm very, very familiar with in South Africa, and we look at the folk at Bushveld Minerals, the guys at Solar MD, Freedom One, Blue Nova, and I'm sure there are more across the country and across the continent that are emerging and making use of these opportunities to say, how do we establish this value base and use this opportunity for Africa? Because it clearly is there. As this tumultuous environment around us changes, can we grasp this opportunity and really do what everybody says we can do, which is that whole phrase about let's leapfrog. Let's really use our mineral base. Let's use our human resource base, not to just be the consumers, but to be the developers and manufacturers and deployers of this technology across the various parts of the chain. And I find that very exciting. I think that is definitely an opportunity that if our regulatory frameworks are well in place and our finances there to support us, it's a definite opportunity for us, not just to safeguard the use of energy, the deployment of electricity, the safeguarding of our economies, but certainly to use this as a growth opportunity into these international markets. So I think the business case is clear. I think the value proposition, hopefully I've put to you, is quite clear. I think the policy and regulatory environments we might ask are a little unclear, and how, working together with our colleagues in government and other regulatory environments, can we as industry and other participants work to make sure that we can capture this opportunity. And I'd like to say in summary, as I finish off, that if we look at this case, to me, this economic case is definitely very, very clear. And I leave you with some of those thoughts. I think dealing with some of the energy poverty on our continent is an absolute non-negotiable. It's an immediate term imperative. I'm not going to highlight the numbers, we all know them. I think the environmental health costs, although some of us argue about our fossil fuel endowment and where that may take us over time, we may well have it, but what is it going to cost to keep it going? And that's not only economically, but it's also in terms of human health. What is it doing in settlements, towns, etc., where people are having to cope with a massive use of diesel gensets and other fossil fuel plant that are creating. And we've costed it in South Africa. We know it adds an additional R1 a kilowatt hour to the cost of electricity in this country. The studies are done. The cost of unserved energy in South Africa, I use it just as a figure because I'm more familiar with it. It's R1 billion being calculated per stage of load shedding per day. Can we afford that? Can we afford it? Can anyone else in Africa afford it? I don't think so. I think the time for that shortage is out. We have solutions. We need to use them. We need to deploy them. Of course, the massive investment, I've talked about that, 30 cents per kilowatt hour for fuel alone. Is that something we really should be paying? Is that something we can afford to pay? It's all of these numbers that I think give us context to the solutions and why they are actually here. They're near term, and we can use them. Grid underinvestment, of course, I think that creates an even bigger case for storage and renewables being a viable, immediate solution. And of course, these decentralized solutions, the standalone option, as I call it, it makes many new options possible, right? The technology, the ownership, the finance, the energy system transition. It gives us an opportunity to really think broadly, to think creatively in an environment which seems to be so difficult to operate in, which seems to be shifting, and often with many factors that we often feel are outside of our control. But I think these opportunities are here now. And the big benefit for me, the big draw card I'd like to leave you with, is that as we talk through all of this the next couple of days, where are we creating jobs? Are we creating jobs here at home, where we need them on our continent, in new industries, with new technologies, with adventurous, if I can call it that, deployment into places we never thought we would see renewables as storage? And I leave you just with one little example of this company from South Africa, Freedom One, and I look at that growth in employment over the last couple of years for a very small company, and I say to myself that this clearly is an indicator for us that this market is working, it's growing, and I'm quite sure that if we had to go and look into the other companies that are doing this on our continent, there certainly will be even better examples at a grander scale of where we can create jobs, livelihoods, we can generate economic input and economic benefit as we look to deploying these new technologies across our continent, and we look to doing this at scale. So John, I'd like to leave it at that. I think I've thrown in a lot of words. I'd certainly like to wish everybody well in deliberations, in discussions, looking at creative ideas as we go forward. And I definitely think this is an opportunity for Africa to play an absolutely leading role in shaping and shifting the markets as we go forward. Thanks very much. Appreciate your time.